So if you're running this for the first time, folks, you're very welcome. This is the Apologetics Academy, which I run every Saturday at 8 p.m. Greenwich Meridian time, which is 3 p.m. Eastern, 2 p.m. Central, or 12 noon Pacific. And each week we bring in different scholars, apologists, experts, speakers across the theological and philosophical spectrum to present to us about their views, arguments for or against the Christian worldview. And then we open it up to open floor Q&A, dialogue, discussion, and debate. And there's a number of ways that you can participate. You can submit questions anonymously by hitting the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You can also raise your hand, and I will promote you to be a co-panelist with our speaker this evening, and you'll have opportunity to interact with and go back and forth with the speaker. Try to keep your questions on topic, and don't pontificate for overly long. And you can also participate in the chat window, or you can simply listen and watch anonymously. This evening we have Dr. James White, who's going to talk to us about textual critical issues. The following week, next Saturday on August 13th, we have Wesley Huff, who's done some graduate work in biblical textual criticism, and he's going to be talking to us about responding to Bart Ehrman's misquoting Jesus. And then the following week we have Ted Wright from Charlotte, North Carolina, who's going to talk to us about the use of Old Testament archaeology in apologetics. So that's what's happening over the course of the next 2 weeks from now. So as I mentioned, this evening we have Dr. James White, who is the director of Alpha and Omega Ministries in Phoenix, Arizona, and also an elder at the Phoenix Reformed Baptist Church. And he's going to be talking to us about controlled versus free transmission of text in relation to the New Testament and Qur'an. Dr. White, do you want to maybe say a few words about yourself, and then maybe just kick into your presentation? That'd be awesome.
Well, I'm nobody, but I've had an opportunity of engaging in a number of debates on this subject. Actually, 2 specific debates contrasting the transmission of the Quran and the New Testament. One was, or I guess 2, with Adnan Rashid in London, and then with Yusuf Ismail. Again, they were both 2-part debates. One in South Africa at Potchefstroom, Northwest University, and the other in London with Adnan Rashid. And it is interesting to compare and contrast the 2, because I think the 2 Islamic speakers took rather different perspectives. But it's a topic that comes up in almost every apologetic encounter, but it's generally the topic that has the least meaningful study being done on it by people on either side. And as a result, most evangelicals struggle a good bit to deal with textual critical issues. Your average evangelical has heard very little about it outside of maybe a quote or 2 from Josh McDowell or something like that. It is certainly one of my convictions that in light of people such as Bart Ehrman, we should recognize the centrality of knowing something about where our Bibles came from, and especially where the New Testament came from, because of the attacks of a wide number of worldviews upon the Christian worldview and the centrality of the inspiration of the scriptures to the Christian worldview. So my great-grandparents probably didn't have to think much about this subject, but in light of the existence of the internet, in light of the connectedness of people today, it's not something that we can any longer ignore. And similarly, on the other side with Islam, the reality is that very few Muslims have either any, well, on the Christian side, you can count probably on 2 hands the number of Christians that have done any reading at all in the subject of the transmission of the text of the Quran. When you go to the Muslim side, while there is an almost universal condemnation of the transmission of the text of the New Testament, there's also next to no serious reading or fair reading at all in meaningful textual critical sources. So combine that with the fundamental ignorance of most Christians on the same subject, and while it underlies almost any topic we would do, I mean, I've done a lot of debates on Islam, and if you dig deep enough, eventually you're going to get into a discussion of what the Quran actually teaches in regards to the alleged corruption of the text of the Bible. And it doesn't matter whether you start off on the crucifixion or the deity of Christ or the nature of salvation, eventually it's going to get back to that. And as a result, this is sort of fundamental, but it's also probably the one area where people know the least about it. I want to spend most of my time on the Christian side and talking about the papyri specifically, and then we'll sort of make some comments in regards to what we mean by free and controlled transmission of the text, because I think that's very important. Some of you, are already read in this field, and so I don't know if there's going to be anything new for you. Maybe in application, possibly, but others may not really have much of a background at all, and it might be one of the reasons that this area remains somewhat of a questionable and difficult area for a lot of people, is the fact that there is a language, there is a lingo that people use, and as a result, if it's not explained, then it can look very, very complicated and look very like they would never be welcome to do any reading in it, really be able to understand what's going on in it. And so with that in mind, sort of hard to know exactly where to start, but I'm going to try as best I can here for a moment. And if everything messes up, then I apologize, but I'm going to see if I can go full screen on this here and share my screen. And boy, you can even choose programs to share. That's nice. It's a pretty decent little program you got here. Allegedly, you should have a papyrus on your screen right now. I'm going to assume, unless someone breaks in, that you do.
You got it.
All right. This actually, if you just went to csntm.org, the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts, you could pull this up yourself and move it around and take a look at it, so on and so forth. This is, well, in fact, let me, you see here the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts, and here is a P46, gives you papyrus, its date, its current location. It's in the Chester Beatty Library in Dublin. And you can, of course, go to, this contains portions of Hebrews right here, Hebrews chapter 8 into the beginning of Hebrews chapter 9, and then you can go to full screen with it, and you can zoom in a good bit and look very, very carefully at the text and so on and so forth. This is the earliest collection that we have of Paul's epistles. And it is interesting, I love to ask the audiences how many of them think that P46, if it's Paul's epistles, contains Hebrews, because Hebrews is anonymous in its authorship. It does contain Hebrews, right after Romans, in fact. So that tells you at least someone at that time in the early church believed that Paul was the author of it. Doesn't prove anything, but it does give you that level of information. It's a very, very important witness. You can see that it's in fairly decent shape. I mean, you can see the form of papyri here. This kind of manuscript, we had some later examples of it, but really since the 1920s and 30s, an entire group of these manuscripts have been unearthed in various digs, also in sometimes unknown ways coming into dealers' hands. But a huge leap forward took place when the papyri were discovered. And so what we had until the papyri came along is we had the unsealed texts, the majuscule texts, such as Sinaiticus, Vaticanus, Alexandrinus. We had these for a fair period of time. And they had moved our knowledge of the text of the New Testament back to within 4 centuries of the birth of Christ, which for almost all works of antiquity is very, very early. And they're very, very important. But the discovery of the papyri moved us much closer to the period of the originals, much closer than any other work of antiquity. And as a result, shed tremendous light on the subject of the contents and the transmission of the text of the New Testament. By the way, as I mentioned them, if anybody wants to go to codexsinaiticus.org, there is a incredibly well done website there for looking at Sinaiticus, for looking up text, zooming in on the text. It's keyed between the translations over here. You can even, if you notice right there, I just clicked on something in the English and it shows it in the unsealed text so you can see it for yourself, and then zoom in on it, and it just is really an amazingly well put together website. And now you can do the same thing with Codex Vaticanus. It's not as quite as user-friendly as far as the tagging and stuff like that goes, but Codex Vaticanus is online as well. And I would imagine eventually vast majority of the major manuscripts will be available in digital format, which is good because we've probably already lost some manuscripts in the fighting in Iraq and places like that, which is a real shame. Let me see how I let me see here. There we go. So I should be back now, I think. I'm not sure.
That's right.
Good. All right. So back to the issue of the papyri. Most of the papyri, of course, and obviously when we talk about papyri, we talk about primarily the material upon which they're written, was a very functional writing platform, but not necessarily one that was designed to last for millennia. And it does reflect the fact that the majority of the early Christians were not in the upper crust. It was a standard writing material. But when we talk about papyri, we are talking about manuscripts that can go back to as early as the 2nd century. And some have even theorized that some of the papyri go earlier than that into the 1st century. And I'm not going to get into the whole green collection thing, which is up in the air right now. Dan Wallace mentioned his debate with Bart Ehrman that manuscripts have been found that go back in the 1st century, and that really hasn't panned out yet. Every time we hear something new about it, it's just about to come out, and it doesn't come out. So I really don't know what's going on with all of that. But leaving that aside, there have been good scholars that have dated some of the papyri into the 1st century. The point is they take us into a period of time. If Sinaiticus and Vaticanus are around 350-ish, middle of the 4th century, that is a time period where the church was no longer under persecution. And hence you could have the production of manuscripts in a more open, formal, professional fashion. The papyri take us into the period where the church was still under persecution. Now, persecution was not a continuous thing. Anybody who knows church history knows that it would ebb and flow. It would be in one part of the empire and not in another, depending on who was in charge in that area. But it was always hanging over the head of the church that there could be persecution at any time. And especially from 250 to 313, there was empire-wide persecution during that time period, which included specifically the legal demand for the destruction of the Christian scriptures. And so the papyri take us back into that time period, into the time period where they may have been produced by individuals who were fleeing from persecution, or someone may have lost their life for copying this particular manuscript. Now, given their age, obviously the vast majority of them are quite fragmentary. Some of the papyri are only a single sheet or a portion of a sheet. A lot of people think P52 is the oldest one we have, and it just has a few verses from John chapter 18 written on the front and the back. Two others that are much more extensive. P45 used to have about 220 pages. We have only a portion of that anymore. It's very fragmentary, but still an extremely important witness. P46, which we were just looking at, P66 and P75, these are gospel manuscripts, which are likewise extremely important in the sense that they, well, here's a good picture of, there's a good shot of P66. I really like this one because instead of just having the single sheet, it gives you what the book itself looked like. And this is actually readable. If you can see N, R, K, Ain, Ha, Lagos, Kai, Ha, Lagos, Ain, Pros, Ton, and Theon would have been out here. Kai, Theos, Ain, Ha, Lagos. And I can't zoom in this program, but you can see right here. Oop, I didn't mean to do that. Right there is the word God, only 2 letters. It's called a nomina sacra. This is one of the things that identified the early Christian writings, is that for some reason Christians developed an abbreviation system for words like God, Lord, Jesus. Depends on the manuscript exactly how extensive it was, but there is Theos, but only 2 letters, theta sigma with a line over top. Many Christian manuscripts have been discovered just simply by someone noticing that one little thing. Here's another one right here. Theou, the genitive form down here. So the nomina sacra remain a real mystery as to how they developed, why they're almost universal in all Christian manuscripts. But P66 is a Gospels manuscript. You can see what it looks like now. You can imagine what it looked like when it was first put together. And these take us right back to 175, 200, that time frame right in there. Same thing is true with P75, another Gospels manuscript. This is also, there's NRK, Ain, Halagos, there's John 1:1. And also from the same time period, this writer was an extremely careful copyist. Gives us a very accurate copy of what he's got. Well, what makes all this significant? And boom. What makes all this significant, of course, is the papyri really didn't introduce us to much in the way of new textual readings, which is important. In other words, the manuscript tradition that we already had prior to the papyri coming to light had pretty much already given us the range of textual readings that we continue to have this day. What's significant about that is that we pushed the text back 200 years by finding the papyri. And in the process, we don't find all sorts of new variants. What's important about this, well, there's a number of things that are important about this. What's important about that specifically is that some people have theorized that, and continue to theorize, and I'm sure this will be discussed next week because this is one of Bart Ehrman's big things. Oh, that really looks weird. Sorry. This is one of Bart Ehrman's big things, is the idea of the dark period, the period where we don't have manuscripts. Now, of course, for any work of antiquity, there is a dark period. Unless you have the originals, there is a period between the writing of the originals and the first extant manuscript copies. The dark period was cut in half by the discovery of the papyri. And in doing so, it's like you have the string of transmission, the light went to this point, now it goes back to here, and guess what? It's the same thing. And so that has forced people like Ehrman to theorize even more radical changes in a much contracted dark period. than had been even suggested before. And you're going against the flow of the data to theorize that, well, it was even more corrupted back then. Well, we just jumped back 200 years, and where's the evidence of this major type of corruption? Though I think it's important to recognize even Ehrman himself is not supportive of the radical perspectives that is so commonly presented by Muslim apologists in the sense of radical changes. He when he's asked, what do you think the New Testament was originally about? He would say it was about Jesus and his death on the cross and the founding of the church. It's in the minutia, not in the major teachings where you where he wants to dwell as saying we're not absolutely certain about this reading here or that reading there. Anyway, that's an extremely important element in looking at the transmission of the text of the New Testament, because by moving the bar back like that, we have been able to even further establish the accuracy of the later transmission of the text. It's not like, the New Age folks say that the Bible used to contain reincarnation. It was taken out at the Council of Constantinople. Well, we have clear evidence that simply isn't the case. That's not what happened. And the papyri only further prove that. The papyri, for example, completely give the lie to the whole Da Vinci Code silliness that made somebody very, very rich, because they go way before the time period that Dan Brown placed in his novels in regards to when the deity of Christ was made up by Constantine, all the rest of that stuff. We have manuscripts long before that demonstrate that whole theory was ridiculous. So we have these papyri, and when we look at them, well, let me show you one here real quick that I had queued up. Here we go. And share screen, desktop 3, share screen. Here's the manuscript I'm going to be becoming exceptionally familiar with. This is manuscript P45. Well, it's a portion of P45. As you can see, P45 is highly fragmentary. It was once about 220 pages long. Now it's not. And it's sometimes, this is actually one of the larger pages. But even then you have what are called lacuna. And textual scholars are so good at some of this stuff that, they've measured the average width of a new in this person's handwriting. And so they can fill in the gaps, what would have fit, what couldn't have fit. I've seen some of my electronic programs even giving you readings down here just based upon threads and things like that. It's truly amazing. But this is what is available for us. And P45, the reason I've chosen to do an extensive amount of work on P45 is because of what it contains and the sources it drew from. It contains fragments from Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Acts. And yet, and this is something that I will have to be verifying, scholars who have studied it have come to the conclusion that it contains, that the manuscripts from which it was copied represent different elements of the manuscript tradition. So if you're familiar with textual criticism, you know that there is the Byzantine manuscript tradition, there's the Western manuscript tradition, and there is the Alexandrian. Some people still hold to a Caesarean, at least in some of the Gospels, manuscript tradition. And basically, manuscript tradition is made up of manuscripts that agree in a certain percentage, a certain percentile with one another consistently over a group of textual variants. So Byzantine manuscripts will contain a certain reading, whereas non-Byzantine manuscripts will not, et cetera, et cetera. And this manuscript from around 225, it seems that the author had access to more than one stream of manuscripts and drew from different streams. Now, obviously, someone back then wouldn't have known what those streams were. We have to recognize the anachronism that is inherent in our study of these things. We're looking back and we are trying to categorize and organize things that wouldn't necessarily have been categorized or organized by the people living in that day. And so we have to keep that in mind. It's sort of like when certain people say, well, the reformers all used one text type. They didn't know that it was a text type. It's anachronistic to ascribe to them, well, they chose this text type. They didn't know there were different text types. So there wasn't any selection between them. It was what was available to them. We can look back and see that, but at the time they would not be able to see that. The scribe of P45 has access to manuscripts from different textual traditions, and he utilizes them. Now, there's a lot more I'm not going to bother going into. If anybody's really, really interested, notice I'm picking up my left hand because I don't think I can hold it with my right hand. Huge magisterial work by Royce on scribal habits in early Greek New Testament papyri. I mean, this thing is massive and covers a number of the key major papyri. If you really want to dig deeply into all the characteristics of these papyri and things like that. And of course, there's a lengthy discussion of P45 in there as well. But here's the apologetic application. If you're starting to fall asleep, I apologize. The apologetic application is if there were multiple streams of transmission, then this takes us back to that early period of time. And what is the major, when you think about what the major arguments are against the transmission of the text in the New Testament, it's that we don't know what the original said or what kind of corruption, purposeful corruption the text might be. So if you're dealing with people that are trying to promote something like reincarnation or something like that, they're theorizing that it was once there, but it's not anymore. Others would say that entire doctrines have been inserted in the New Testament, such as the deity of Christ or the resurrection or the crucifixion or whatever else it might be. Well, those assertions require proof. They require some kind of evidence to make them meaningful and understandable. And unfortunately, the vast majority of apologetic encounters, when that accusation is made, the person making it has no scholarly leg to stand on. They're just throwing it out there for effect. It doesn't really have any major impact. It's meant to get emotions going, not thinking. But the Christian needs to be able to recognize these claims, and if we understand the transmission of the text, be able to explain that the breadth and depth of the New Testament manuscript tradition, especially in light of the papyri, shows us that from the earliest period, we have a very reliable text. And since these manuscripts are so far flung from different scribes in different areas at different times, that did have access to the whole breadth of the variations that exist to us today, the fact that there is no evidence, there's no manuscript that gives us this wildly different New Testament. We've never found a Gospel of John that doesn't contain the deity of Christ, or that would give us the Jesus was merely a prophet type perspective. All that kind of stuff would require some evidence. If there had been all these different readings of the New Testament, then we'd still be able to find those readings in the various families, and the families would be far flung from one another as far as their readings are concerned. That's not what we have. the difference between the most disparate, different elements of the manuscript tradition, from the Alexandrian to the Byzantine, the difference between the two is extremely minor and easily determinable as to what the origin of those readings actually were. In other words, they all fill in within the realm of what would be the natural result of many, many hands copying many, many times. Because we know literally thousands of manuscripts are destroyed. We have evidence from secular papyri during the persecutions of, in one church in Egypt, 300 manuscripts destroyed from that one church. Well, and they talked about 300 churches had been sacked during the imperial persecution at the beginning of the 4th century. So that's a lot of manuscripts that were destroyed, which means a lot of manuscripts had to be produced. That means a lot of people were copying. And if there had been this kind of major differences, these all sorts of different New Testaments with different teachings, we would have evidence of it. And in fact, the farther back we would push, the more difference we would find amongst those manuscripts. But just the opposite is what we have found. And so the papyri push us back to a point where it becomes very, very obvious that Kurt Aland was correct when he spoke of the tenacity of the New Testament text, that once a reading enters into the manuscript tradition, it remains in the manuscript tradition. It continues to give evidence of its existence. Now, at first that sounds bad, but it's not. What makes that very good is that if every reading that's ever been there is still testified somewhere in the manuscript tradition, that means all the original readings are still testified in the manuscript tradition. And that's the vital point. Rob Bowman came up with a really, really good illustration of this. He said, what we look at when we're looking at the New Testament manuscript tradition, it's like having a 10,000 piece jigsaw puzzle. And the worst thing could ever happen is if you have a 10,000 piece jigsaw puzzle, you get to the end and you only have 9,999 pieces. The cat carried away the one that you need, and you get rid of the cat after that. But what would you rather have? Would you rather have 9,900 pieces or 10,100 pieces? And with the New Testament, what we have is the 10,100 piece scenario. Scribes were very conservative. We have a number of places, such as John 5:4, where what was evidently a marginal note, an explanatory marginal note, has been inserted into the text and become a part of the later text. And so in other words, the scribe's copying a manuscript, he may not know who originally wrote it, may not be able to go and ask someone, why did you put this here? Is this an explanatory note? Or did you just skip it when you were copying? And because that's what they would do. If they were copying and they skipped a line, they missed something, which could easily happen. They would, instead of just tearing the sheet up, they would put it in the margin where it was supposed to go. Well, that's also where you would make an explanatory note. So somebody else later on, how would they necessarily know? And so the tendency of the Christian scribe was to be very conservative and to include, not to exclude any material for fear of missing something. Now, the result of that is that the later manuscripts tend to be longer than the earlier manuscripts, only in the sense that you have marginal notes, you have sometimes conflation. If you're copying from two manuscripts, the same book, and one manuscript has one reading, the other manuscript has a different reading, you put them both in, thinking that maybe one or the other missed the other reading in their original, and so you get conflated readings. That expands it just a little bit. There's always the issue of the expansion of the names of deity. So it's very easy to create a chart showing earlier manuscripts to later manuscripts, Lord becoming Lord Jesus becoming Lord Jesus Christ, that type of thing. Again, very common in the expansion of piety. And remember, a lot of this didn't require a person to purposefully make an alteration. if they had, for example, memorized a verse in a longer form, maybe if there's a parallel pass between Matthew and Mark, when they're copying Mark, because it's already memorized, they just might do it that way naturally, not even realize they've just now altered the text. That's probably how Colossians 1:14 came along. Colossians 1:14, Ephesians 1:7 are parallel passages, but Ephesians 1:7 has the phrase "in his blood." Colossians 1:14 doesn't, but a few later manuscripts insert it, probably not because the scribe was trying to change it, but because he had memorized it in the form in Ephesians and just automatically put it in that same form in Colossians. So that's something to keep in mind in regards to the conservative issue. Now, I don't want to get caught up short by anybody if they are familiar with P45. But the scribe of P45, I'll just spend just a second on this. Very interesting scribe. He wasn't trying to produce an exact reproduction. And one of the real tricky things in dealing with P45 is being able to identify the unique edits that he makes based upon style. He's trying to sort of be very concise. Is to identify when he doesn't have a reading because it was a stylistic thing, or when he doesn't have a reading because the original in front of him didn't have the reading. And P45 presents a completely different challenge on that very level. And of course, you have to realize we can't be anachronistic. We have to recognize that we're looking back at the time period, and we don't know almost anything about these scribes. Why were they making this copy? Did they understand what they were copying? Was this a believer making a copy? Or was it an unbeliever being paid to make a copy by a richer patron who didn't have the literary skills to produce it? Vast majority of instances, we don't have any idea. We have no idea whatsoever, which is one of the reasons I really struggle with a lot of the modern shift in emphasis in textual criticism to the reading of the minds of the scribes, because we don't know who they were. We can't read their minds. It's just it seems to me to be a fool's errand to even attempt to start going down that path. Well, anyway, what does all this have to do with our apologetic application? Well, it was clear to me in the two debates that I've done on this topic, as I said, one in Potchefstroom and one in London, very, very clear to me that my Muslim opponents really struggled with the idea that it's better to have many manuscripts that have textual variation between them than it is to have a smaller number of manuscripts that have been controlled in their production and transmission. In other words, to a person who is not familiar with how manuscripts are transmitted over time, it would seem better, it would be more intuitive to have a situation where you have a controlling authority that has control over the text and says, we're going to make sure that every copy that is made is in line with what we want the text to be. And certainly, if you have an organization that has the power and ability to control a text, it's going to result in a much narrower range of readings than a situation where you would have what's called free transmission, which is what you have in the New Testament, where you have no control whatsoever over the transmission of the text. It's being copied here and there, and that manuscript gets destroyed, and you have some people doing copying that have never really been trained to do so overly well, and they don't have their copyist card, and so on and so forth. The free transmission of the text is where the text is simply put out there and it's transmitted without any external guiding force, no redactions, no control over the text. And that's going to, a manuscript that is freely transmitted is going to end up, if it's a popular text, if it's a text no one wants to read, it's a whole different world, but it's going to end up with a smaller number of textual variants within it. And so for many people, it's like, well, that's what we want. A lot of people don't like having those little notes on the side of the page in their Bible. They don't want to have some manuscripts say this and some manuscripts say that. They'd rather have, this is the text. I understand that. But here's the problem. When we contrast the New Testament transmission with that of the Quran, it's really a classical contrast between a freely transmitted text and a controlled transmission text. Because unless you are going to dismiss the testimony not only of Sahih al-Bukhari, but you might want to read, I was thinking about reading all of it, but I won't, but you might want to read the lengthy section in Al-Kindi. And if you can track down a book, it's not easy to get hold of, but the Early Christian-Muslim Dialogue, a collection of documents in the first 3 Islamic centuries, translations and commentary, edited by N.A. Newman. In Al-Kindi's section, there is a fascinating parallel account, clearly drawing from the same sources that Bukhari did, in regards to the Uthmanic revision. And what you have is the attempt in the classical Islamic documents. You have the recording of an attempt at creating a controlled transmission of the text of the Quran, because the fear, we don't want to become like the Jews and the Christians that argue over their texts. And variations are coming up in the citations and the recitations, and as a result, do something about this. And so Uthman does, and when you have the destruction of non-complying texts, which is not only found, at least alluded to in Bukhari, but it's in a number of other early sources, and it's in Al-Kindi very explicitly. That is controlled. That is controlled transmission right there, and there is a cost to that. There is a cost to controlled transmission. The result almost always is a more homogeneous text. But I submit to you that the cost is certainty as to the original readings. Because once you place a text under the control of an authority, that authority now becomes the ultimate source of the text and not the authors. So if there is a revision and the perpetrators of the revision are successful in the destruction of the preceding readings, you can't get past the revision to the original. And so your trust then can no longer be in the original, but in the ones creating the revision, that they faithfully reproduce the original. But if they faithfully produce the original, then why would there need to be destruction of what came before it? This always becomes the question. And it's not insignificant to me that a number of the variants that are noted in the early tafsir literature have to do with the very issues that were most important in the Islamic community at the time of the production of the earliest Qur'ans. So, for example, I could put on the screen now the accordance version of the Messialan text or the Biblia Hebraicus, Trigartensia, whatever. We could look at the critical texts that we have available to us in Christian studies of both the Old and New Testaments. And they come with complete manuscript citations, locations of manuscripts, what the manuscripts contain. These are critical editions. As of yet, there's no critical edition of the Quran. The new study Quran is sort of a, since it admits the existence of textual variation, it's sort of a move in that direction. The Corpus Chronicum project is ongoing, but it's just that ongoing. There's not a whole lot of funding for this kind of stuff. And so at this period of time, you do have things like this. This is one of my two museum quality manuscripts. This is the Paris 328 manuscript. Full-size reproductions, photographic reproductions of these manuscripts. And of course, this is useful, extremely useful to have something like this. And then there's less expensive, that's extremely expensive, less expensive. Here's the Resvin manuscript. Not quite as high quality reproduction, but you have things like this that are sort of floating around out there. Very, very, very few people have that kind of material available to them to look into this stuff. But we just don't, the reality is that critical Quranic studies is still in its infancy in comparison to the New Testament, and especially in providing to lay people a meaningful text that would allow you to examine the differences either in vocalization or even in the razm, in the consonantal text between the major manuscripts, and we don't even really have a decent handle on what the major manuscripts are in the sense of a centralized location that can assign consistent numbers. This was a problem when the New Testament was in this stage. Well, you call that manuscript that, but he calls the same manuscript this, and so is that, what if you didn't know that they were two different manuscripts, or the same manuscript is being called two different things? You'd say there are two manuscripts that had this reading. It's only one manuscript. All that kind of stuff, that's where we are with the Quran. Because there hasn't been a standardization of the sources yet in a critical edition. And the result of that is that, well, there's a lot of things. I'm skipping ahead of myself here, but the Quran as it exists in the hands of many Muslims today, and even laying aside the differences between the various printed editions that predominate in certain parts of the world today, because there are differences between them. But even that is not a critical text. The most popular, the Egyptian 1924 Arabic edition was not put together by scholars who were doing meaningful textual variant study of different manuscripts. It was put together for a school system that wanted to standardize text. And now there are many Muslims who hold that text up. This is exactly what Uthman had. Well, how do you know that? I mean, you can, well, I just have faith. Everybody agrees. That's not how you know things. That text needs to be examined just as carefully on the basis of the earliest manuscripts as any other. And yet, what we need to recognize is when we're talking about the New Testament and the Quran, we cannot just go one-to-one correspondence and comparing them. You have the Quran's barely a little over half the length of the New Testament, total words-wise. You have multiple authors writing it multiple times in the New Testament. The historic Islamic perspective on the Quran is one person writing over only a little over 2 decades. Whether that's the case or not is another issue, but that's an area of dispute. But it's not a one-to-one correspondence, especially because the Quran has to undergo 600 less years of handwritten production and copying than the New Testament does. And it is a formally controlled transmission of text versus a free transmission of the text. most people really struggle if they've never thought about how we can have confidence in what we possess. Most people have never really struggled in thinking through the fact that it's far better to have a freely transmitted text than a controlled text. With the free transmission, I can look at anyone and without batting an eye, without hanging my brain on the door, without feeling any sense of embarrassment, say that I have absolutely full confidence that all the original readings of the New Testament continue to exist in the manuscript tradition today. That there is nothing that was given to us by the Holy Spirit of God that has not been preserved for us down to this day. Now, we may have to compare manuscripts to be able to know which is which, and there are some textual variants where, maybe someday we'll find an even earlier manuscript that'll throw the weight behind one side or the other. But when I look at a variant, I have absolute confidence that one of those readings is the original reading. It's still there. When you have a controlled transmission of the text, that's not how it works. You can't say that. If those who made the redactions and revisions were successful in the destruction of the competitors of their new official version, we'll never know about it. We have no way of knowing about it. That's what makes the Sa'ana manuscripts so important. That's what makes the discussion of the palimpsest manuscripts so important, is there seems to be multiple sources that testify to some kind of a revision work under Uthman. There's possibility later on too, but especially under Uthman. And the question then becomes, why does he become the final authority? Because he has to become the final authority. If he's making those changes, if there's no mechanism whereby we can check what they did, then your final trust ends up at a later point in the transmission of that text over time. And I just don't think that's something that a lot of Muslims have really thought about. And I think it really is one of the major differences. And I'd say it is the major difference between how the New Testament text was transmitted and how the Quranic text was transmitted. And now we need to be very careful at this point. Unfortunately, many Muslims will grab hold of a quote out of a Bart Ehrman book and just run with it as if it's gospel truth. And the same way, a lot of Christians will grab a quote in regards to the Quran and run with it. Given the nature of the text, how much smaller it is, and how much younger it is, we would fully expect that the Quranic text would contain significantly less textual variation than the New Testament. Given its history, its size, and the fact that it has undergone significantly less centuries of handwritten transmission, it had better be a significantly more stable text as far as the number of textual variants is concerned. And if the Quran had a free transmission rather than a controlled transmission, everything would be different in regards to the analysis of the level of certainty that we can have in the readings that are present in the manuscript tradition. But since it's a controlled text, changes everything. Changes everything. And now you have to ask the question, how can we know? Because if we look at any textual variant in the New Testament, we can always look to other manuscripts than the one we're looking at for further guidance and light. If you destroy those manuscripts, changes everything. So they're just some of the thoughts. There's so much more that can be said, but we're coming up at the top of the hour, and it's told that an hour was basically what we're looking at. So maybe we can expand upon some of those issues. But hopefully that is at least sort of whet your appetite for next week. I normally at this time I'm just getting back from a really long bike ride, but I might try to join in, because certainly dealing with Bart Ehrman's assertions on this subject, something I've done in person, of course, but it is, I think, something that's very vitally important today, and maybe sort of help lay a little bit of foundation for that for next week.
Well, thank you, Dr. White. This is the interactive portion of the program. So if you would like to ask a question, Dr. White, raise a comment or a question or express disagreement and so on, then you're invited to raise your hand.
Could I have 10 seconds, because I forgot my water in the other room and I'm about to die?
Go ahead.
Good stuff.
Hey, Gordon. There are you there, Gordon?
Yep.
Okay.
Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you, Gordon.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Gordon.
Okay, dope.
All right. So Gordon had his hand raised with a question. Go ahead, Gordon.
Sure, if he's got his water. Yeah, I suppose my question is prefaced with a comment, and that would be how a lot of groups, as mentioned in the talk, and thank you for the talk, like to capitalize on this, period of darkness that, Jesus was a vegan, or Jesus was an Islamic prophet, or Jesus taught Mormonism, or Jesus taught what Jehovah's Witnesses teach, and how that can be, or what caution would you give with the fact that the early church fathers quote the New Testament extensively, and can the same be said of the Hadith? Could you reconstruct Islamic ayah from Hadith all put together? That'd be my question.
Well, that is interesting. I've not seen a study on what percentage of the Quran is reproduced in the Hadith. I'm sure there have been studies done like that. My concern, the early church fathers are an important source of information. Certainly Ignatius and Clement, especially the apostolic fathers, very important for the establishment of a very, very, very early respect for the scriptures and use of the scriptures. But what we have to remember is the patristic writings went through the exact same transmission process as the New Testament. They just weren't copied as often. And for many of them, our earliest extant manuscripts are long after the originals. And hence, the question then becomes, what's the possibility or even the probability of a scribe amending the early father's quotation to the form of text that he was familiar with in his day? So there's actually a second critical step in looking at the early church fathers that comes into play. And so their testimony can be absolutely decisive in whether a verse was or was not in the manuscript tradition. For example, I saw a flash of light. I'm not sure what that was, but if a laser shows up, I'm ducking. For example, the woman taken in adultery in John chapter 5, not found in any Greek manuscripts of the Gospel of John before the 5th century. Well, you can look at patristic sources and at least get some idea of when the story became common or something like that. But for specifics of grammar or spelling or word order and things like that, very often, even today in the pulpit, a minister will paraphrase something. And even while writing, will paraphrase the scripture. And so it doesn't really tell us whether the manuscripts they had available to them read a certain way or another way, because you could have some paraphrastic action going on there too. And so most of the critical texts, of course, will list the early church fathers, but they will, very often you'll have Augustine 1/4. So he reads this way 1 out of 4 times, then down to the next reading, Augustine 3/4. 3 out of 4 times he reads it this way. So he's actually on both sides. How much of that is due to the fact that he wrote it differently, or later scribes of his wrote it differently? It adds even another step in the analysis. So the early church's writings are important, but they're not nearly as definitive as an actual manuscript where the scribe's actually producing the text and trying to reproduce the text faithfully. As to the hadith, like I said, obviously they are important in regards to the recognition of a text being original, but they are subject to the very same, actually they're subject to even another level, because you have the rules of determining what is sahih and what is not, would probably make a hadith that would give variant textual information automatically non-sahih, because it would disagree with the currently accepted text. So in that sense, I'm not sure that it can even be used by a faithful Sunni in a meaningful fashion in bringing textual light to the Quran, because I think it would automatically be considered not unsound if it differed from the current traditional text.
And to what extent would Greek dialects play in spelling variations amongst the manuscript traditions?
Primarily, in that case, given that Koine was empire-wide, that primarily impacts the spelling of place names. So there are a couple of variants, a number of variants actually in the Gospels, where that may be the origination, is that a certain place name was spelled one way from if you were north and one way if you were south, something along those lines. But for the majority of the language itself, the written form didn't vary that much. It really wouldn't have that much of an impact.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. White.
All has gone quiet. Sorry, I was muted there. I'm just bringing up Josh Parikh from the University of Oxford. Josh.
Hey. Hey.
How are you doing?
Are you here?
Yes, I can hear you.
Can you hear me? Great. Yeah, I'm Josh. Are you saying something, Jonathan?
Yep, go ahead.
Cool. Yeah, I'm a student at Oxford. Yeah, and studying philosophy, politics, and economics. And go to.
I'm very sorry for you.
Yeah, it's a hard life. Yeah, and I go to the same church as Nabil Qureshi.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, a load of other stuff, and have watched your stuff, and I'm sure you hear it the whole time, but it's great.
Well, if he starts going liberal on us, punch him in the nose for me, okay?
I will do, but yeah, it's all good. Yeah, I've got a couple of questions. So I suspect Jonathan would prefer it if I stayed to the topic, so I will mainly. So one would be, what are your thoughts on the satanic verses kind of here? Do you have a strong opinion on them? Do you think they're authentic? And do you think we've got enough knowledge of the tradition here to make that kind of judgment?
Well, I would say that given how early the story appears, Ibn Hashim's version of Ibn Ishaq, and the criterion of embarrassment, right? It certainly let's just put it this way: any Muslim that would quote from a Bart Ehrmanish source should have no problem whatsoever dealing with the the satanic verses, because certainly on the level of the criterion of embarrassment and things like that, they've got a pretty strong case to being original. You would think, especially with the history of what happens in the development of Islamic theology, that they would have been expunged pretty early on if there was the opportunity to do so, but it wasn't. So it does seem to have relevance. I think that would be relevant to an analysis of whether the later Sunni orthodoxy, that there's nothing of Muhammad in the Quran. The whole development of the idea that the Quran is, this heavenly tablet, and it's sent down on Laylat al-Qadr to the angel Jibreel and then piecemealed out to Muhammad over time. That very non-historical concept of inspiration, that would impact how you viewed that, because Muhammad's growth in understanding his role as a prophet and things like that would, the only way you could really explain it would be in light of that. Or a momentary weakness where he felt he could bring peace to the Quraysh, and this is how he did it, but he was corrected or whatever. You could come up with various things, but it would require you basically to abandon the fundamental tenet of Sunni orthodoxy in regards to there is nothing of man in the Quran at all. I think that's why they haven't really been willing to go that direction.
Okay.
But I think it's interesting. I've actually come to think of it, I don't think I've ever done a debate where that has come up. But I've heard debates where it's been the central thesis.
Yeah, I think David Wood's done a couple on verses, which I've tend to be the ones I've watched on it.
I think he did it with Adnan, if I recall correctly.
Yeah, I think he's done it with Adnan, and he did one with some other guy on a broader thing on Muhammad, Ali something. But yeah,
Ali Attai?
Ali Attai, there we are. Ali Attai, yeah. So he's done that one. Yeah, those are the ones I've heard on that. Yeah, I mean, so if we've got, so that's possibly one of the more significant ones. And I think, I've heard your debate with Yusuf on this. How many kind of variants do you think there are possibly here? So somewhere like the New Testament, you hear there's the classic thing, or there are kind of 100,000 variants and that kind of thing. And there's kind of
400,000. 400,000
variants in the New Testament. And of course, no context given to that at all.
Right.
How many are we possibly talking about here that are meaningful with the Quran? Is there, I mean, you've said before that kind of Quranic textual criticism is in its infancy compared to the New Testament, but can you give any estimates? Are we talking 5? Are we talking 100? Is there anything?
Well, yeah, I don't think an answer can be given. I would not want to hazard one for this simple reason. I think back in about 2007, 2008, a palimpsest Quran manuscript came up for auction at Sotheby's, and a number of us were watching it very closely to see where it would go. It was purchased anonymously, has never been seen since. How many manuscripts like that exist, and what meaningful early variants might they contain that we will never know about? Don't know. I have no way of knowing.
Okay. And
the problem is the difference between the controlled with the controlled transmission. You really can't answer those questions. With the free transmission, we can come up with a pretty decent answer, and the reality that 99% of them do not impact the meaning of the text. But with a controlled text, unless, and I'm sure you're familiar with the Sa'anafine, man, that was pretty weird. Break through a wall. Hey, look at all that stuff in there. How often is that going to happen? That might give you an insight back before the revision line. If something like that happens again in a place where the manuscripts don't just disappear, then that might start giving us enough of a foundation to make somewhat of an educated guess. But right now, any guess would be so uneducated that it really wouldn't have a whole lot of meaning to it. So I don't know. I will say this. I'm not one of those folks. I do not think that there is that the Uthmanic revision was a theologically relevant one, in the sense that even if it was primarily focused upon making sure that certain texts that spoke to succession spoke to it correctly, that's still going to be a small percentage of the text. And so, given how young the Quran is, how small it is, I can't imagine that relevant variants would be that many.
Right.
But the problem is we just can't know, given both the state of the study and, more importantly, we may never be able to know, which decreases our overall confidence because of the controlled transmission of the text, which is not what you have with the free transmission. Right.
Okay. Well, that's helpful. Fair
enough. I think we need to be really careful because when we do apologetics, we're so often responding to wild-eyed, unfair, ungrounded, irresponsible claims about our text,
right,
that it erodes our truth commitment, to where we're willing to make some statements the other direction that we really shouldn't be making. And we as Christians, we just simply have to guard ourselves against that.
Yeah, no, very much agreed on that. And that's why I'm just so this kind of stuff, that when I interact with Muslims, interacting online, interacting other places, it's just kind of making sure how careful and how much weight this can have in an apologetic. That if I were to interact with Muslims, I'd almost certainly go to something like either the disciples of Jesus and the fact that where it says in the Quran that the disciples were Muslim, and be like, that's nonsense, or where it kind of Surah 4:1 verse 157 and that kind of stuff. That's
right. And those are solid places to go. I think. Did you see the debate that I had with Shabir at the University of Pretoria in South Africa?
Which one was that?
It was on the earliest sources. Did the earliest disciples of Jesus?
That was a great one. That was a really good one. And really frustrating.
I think that's a very strong position to argue from. A very strong position to argue from. You can go. In fact, what I like doing, and I've said this many times, and I've been a complete failure in going through it, but I want to produce a Gospel of Mark for Muslims, because the deity of Christ is all over the Gospel of Mark. Every time I hear somebody say, "Well, you've got Mark's low Christology," I just want, what are you talking about? That's why I like to go there, because there tends, especially if the Muslim has had a lot of interaction online, there tends to be somewhat of a hesitation in looking at John. Go to Mark. You can nail it down for the Gospel of Mark, and then when you can tie that in with Glorious Lord and James, you can go to the Carmen Christi and the Shema in 1 Corinthians 8 and demonstrate that these earliest traditions all have this. I think it's vitally important.
I'm with you. I'm very much with you on that. I think, and that Jonathan debated Shabir Ali last year, and that Shabir did the classic of evolving Christology, and I was like, what about Mark 2? And so that was fun.
Also, you've got Q sayings which affirm the deity of Christ as well. You have Matthew 11, Luke 7, where Jesus takes Malachi 3 and applies it to John the Baptist, and identifies himself, namely the Son of Man, as the one whose way is prepared for by John the Baptist in fulfillment of Malachi 3, thus self-identifying as Yahweh. And in Matthew 11:27, Luke 10:22, which is another Q saying, he claims exclusive and exhaustive knowledge of the Father, something which no mere creature could ever affirm. And then you also have the fact that Paul, in addition to the earlier sources quoted by Paul at Carmen Christi, 1 Corinthians 6, and so forth, you also had the fact that Paul was approved of by the leadership of the Jerusalem church, Peter and James in particular. And you got
it's all made up. It's all made up, right?
I think you've forgotten about Mark 13:32, and that overrides everything else. And you've forgotten about that. That's the important thing you need to know about. One of the, in fact, here's a good one actually, just in terms of consistency. With there are kind of a couple of points I want to bring up here. One was one of the things you said about was with New Testament textual criticism, that you're wary of Bart Ehrman, for example, being like, here are all this textual variant is theologically motivated, and your response to that was that we just don't know enough about the early scribes to make that kind of claim. I wonder how that worked with the fact that you were talking about the I think so, for example, with the succession stuff, I think it's the end of Surah 2, right. But it might be wrong. But succession stuff, that you talked about that being plausibly politically motivated, because right. That was the kind of thing going on at the time. I wonder how that works. How do we know enough about the early Islamic community to say that, but not about the New Testament scribes?
Right. Well, because we don't know who the scribes were. We know who Uthman was, and we know from the Islamic perspective that it's Uthman who's doing this, and Uthman is embroiled in the succession issue that will very shortly result in the Sunni-Shia split. And so the issue is the motivation of someone that the sources tell us is exactly engaging in redaction, over against an anonymous scribe, to whom we then have to attribute certain levels of theological knowledge so that they would even be interested in the heresy or the orthodoxy, depending which direction it goes, of a debate going on their day. I know people today, you're probably familiar with the debate going on right now in regards to eternal functional subordination.
Yeah.
How many people are?
Yeah. Right.
Not many. So if someone were to make a comment today, and they don't even know what EFS is, it would be improper to attribute that to the EFS controversy when the vast majority of Christians don't even know what it is that it's taking place.
Right.
But there is no question about the fact that Uthman spoke to the issue and was in the middle of the debate over the proper character of succession in the caliphate. And so when you see clear textual changes in the manuscripts, and then of course that stub page with the very clearly inserted material, I think the connection has to be considered at that point, because you have a basis for it. We have historical information saying this individual who was in control of the text at this time was concerned about this theological issue, and it resulted in this, which you can't do with I can't think of a single scribe in the history of the church that we would know that, at least in the first 1,000 years.
Okay.
To be able to attribute that kind of knowledge to them.
Yeah. Okay, that's useful. Grudem's fun. Grudem's lots of fun. And have you seen his recent endorsement of Trump? Have you seen that article?
I have.
Yeah.
I have. Yeah.
Yeah. I wrote an article on that.
He's taken a lot of heat for it too.
Yeah,
really
he has. So, from me as well, which is all fun. I think so. Kind of last couple of questions. I'm sure Jonathan's got lots of people waiting. In terms of, I'd be interested. You're a presuppositionalist. I'm a Calvinist. I'm not quite sure where I am on presuppositionalism. I'd just be interested in the way how does your use of evidence work here, that you have to rely a lot on evidence in the way you do things? Pretty much all, everything you're doing with the textual criticism stuff is you're analyzing evidence and inferring a conclusion from it. How, you may have been clear on it elsewhere, but how does that interact with your presuppositionalism overall? The fact that you're kind of looking at something like P52 and they're saying, or looking at something like the Allens and saying that we know that any reading that comes into the tradition stays in the tradition, and you're doing that on the basis of evidence. How does that interact with your presuppositionism overall?
Well, Van Til said all evidence is God's evidence, and presuppositionalism is not opposed to evidence at all, because it says that all evidence to be meaningful has to be interpreted within a worldview that makes it meaningful, and the only worldview that can make it consistently meaningful is the Christian worldview based upon the triune God. But for me, the issue of presuppositionalism is whether you are putting the sinful rebel man in the position of judging the Almighty God, in fact, or even offering to him the position of judging God's existence by the evidence as he interprets it, rather than God judging his existence by the evidence as God interprets it. That really is, to me, the difference. And from a Reformed perspective, given a Reformed anthropology, I can't I can't see how a classical evidentialist position consistently works. And yes, I, of course, listened to the debate between R.C. Sproul and Greg Bahnsen. And if you haven't, I'd recommend it to you.
Okay.
Because it really, I think, lays out a lot of these particular issues. But it's not that presuppositionalism says you cannot deal with evidence. What it's saying is you cannot put the sinner in the position of thinking that they have the right to judge that evidence and thereby judge the God who makes it even knowable to them. That's really what the issue is.
Okay, that's helpful in terms of clarifying things. Yeah, I agree with a lot of presuppositionalist stuff. Things like there is no neutral ground, all the reformed anthropology stuff. I'm very on board with. It's just that I have some questions and that would need to do more work on it too. Yeah, I think partly I see bad philosophy sometimes done in presuppositionalism, and that upsets me deeply, as I'm sure you get upset by bad textual criticism, that kind of stuff. Final couple of things. One is that if people are to go from here on, there's loads and loads and loads of stuff on textual criticism that's very easy to point to. Things like Reinventing Jesus is brilliant, or How We Got the Bible, I think, is another book, and there's loads and loads, and you've got loads on your website. In terms of Islamic textual criticism, if people want to go from here and be like, oh, I want to read a bit of and if for apologetic interactions or for their own study, but probably more for apologetic interactions, is there much beyond the couple of debates you've had and what you've said tonight, is there much that you can point people to?
Well, I mean, I certainly haven't done as much in it as I would like to as far as actually producing something. I touched on it briefly in my book, but it's not. Company House certainly didn't want me going any more in depth in that than I did. But unfortunately, the vast majority of that information is going to be found in scholarly articles. Greg Nichols' stuff is really good on that. You might want to.
You mean Gordon Nichols or?
Is it CHOLS?
Okay, it might be. I'm thinking of different other Nichol, a gentle answer guy.
Yeah. Sorry, Gordon Nichol. Narrative Tampering and Earliest Commentaries on the Qur'an. Okay. And then Gentle Answer. Yeah, and he's got good bibliographies and stuff like that.
Okay, that's useful.
A lot of them are foreign language bibliographies, but that's how it works.
That's okay.
You're an Oxford dude, so you can read all languages anyways.
Not at all. And what I do have usefully is lots and lots of access to articles for free, which is great. That's one of the things. And a couple of questions out of interest. Are you voting for Trump? And when's the Shabir Ali book coming out?
And what was the last one?
And when's the Shabir Ali book coming out now?
Ask Shabir Ali. As I was mentioning to Jonathan, if he doesn't start writing, it'll never happen.
He's not writing.
I've sent him an entire chapter. He's supposed to send me a response, and it's been months. So the only option I have right now is just simply to write everything I can possibly write, which gives him a huge advantage in having all my material first.
Right.
And then past that, I don't know what to do. He's just been rather tardy in getting around to stuff. So I'm just waiting on him, and I'm ready to go when he gets going, but I can't, you can't write a co-authored book by yourself. That's sort of violates the definition of co-authorship. So, and as to election stuff, wrong context discussion of such things, but right now there is no meaningful qualified candidate for office as the President of the United States that is running at all.
Fine. Okay.
There had been, there aren't anymore.
Okay. Good. Okay, that's fine. I'll leave other people to ask questions, but thanks for answering questions. So, yeah.
Thank you, Josh. Let me bring up Garrett.
Okay.
Hello.
Hi, Garrett.
Hey, guys. Can you hear me?
We can.
All right. Excellent. Hey, nice to meet you, James.
Yes, sir.
I've watched some of your debates, so definitely a fan. I watched your debate with N.T. Wright on I can't remember where you up. Oh, it was I know it is bad now. Yeah, it was a good one. Hey, I wanted to ask you a question. This is just a totally random question. I'm sure you're familiar with Kenneth Bailey's paper on his theory of oral tradition.
Oral tradition regards the New Testament?
Yeah. Well, it's mostly on, he basically did a field work on oral tradition in modern Egypt. And
is this cited by Ehrman in his new book?
I don't know. It's I don't know if Ehrman ever cites it. He may, but it's
Sounds
something
familiar.
that Blake Gunta actually pointed me onto it, and it's something that I've heard referenced again and again. I remember Darrell Block actually mentioned it in a conference last spring, and I was interested if you'd ever heard of it and if you knew of the critique of it from Theodore J. Whedon. They're both two extremely good papers. If you or anybody else would be interested in looking into them, they are. I'll put the names of them in the chat. But they're really good. Kenneth Bailey basically did a study on a preacher in South Africa who has an oral tradition that has developed around him in the last 50 years or some odd since his death, and he wrote a paper about it talking about controlled oral tradition versus, I think, informal controlled versus informal uncontrolled, and he kind of talks about how, the process of oral tradition. And then there's another individual who wrote a critique of it that's really good, in Theodore J. Whedon, and basically just kind of dives into his evidence, and Kenneth left out some things and Theodore adds some things. I'll put it in the chat if anybody would like to read it.
Sounds interesting.
Yeah.
All right. Is that all from you, Gary?
Yeah, that's all I had.
All right.
Hey, Jonathan, give me 5 seconds. I need ice.
Okay. Hey, Stephen.
Hey, yo, what's up? How's everything, John?
Doing fine. How are you doing, Stephen?
Okay. Just gonna run all this quick by James because I gotta get off of work in a little bit.
Okay.
Hey, Dr. James, Vladimir, enter Sunni Kafir, and Mushrik.
Entschuldigung? Was sprechen Sie?
No. I was talking to Vlad in the comments.
Oh.
Yeah, he and I are having somewhat Shia-Sunni conflict at the moment. So, anyway, how you doing today, Dr. White?
Well, I'm just put ice on my hands, so other than that, fine.
Cool. Yeah. Question I wanted to raise regarding the controlled versus uncontrolled transmission. Basically, a while back, I read Ijaz Ahmed's article. He basically attempts to defend the controlled transmission position. Does a very horrible job at it. But basically, just very quickly, could you outline like the biggest problems with the controlled transmission position?
Well, the controlled transmission in this instance, I mean, you could. If you take the controlled transmission system out of handwritten copies in antiquity and place it in the modern period with computer technology, we're talking about a completely different context. But when we're talking about antiquity and an organization controlling the transmission of the text, it must shift the ultimate authority for the readings of the text from the original author to whoever has the control over the transmission process itself. Whereas the free transmission of the text always has as its final authority the original readings and not an external authority to the text itself. So what that means is when we have a textual variant in a freely transmitted text, for example, in 1 John 3:1, the phrase kai esmen is not in the majority of Greek texts. It's a phrase, and we are, in regards to our adoption as sons and daughters of God. Well, what's our ultimate authority in determining whether John wrote kai esmen or whether he didn't? Well, it's our desire to know what the original author wrote and wanted to communicate. And so we will interpret the manuscript evidence in the light of our ultimate desire of the original intent and purpose of the author. When you have a controlled transmission, you can't go to the manuscripts any longer to determine original authorial intent and communication. Instead, you have to go to the person or persons that control and determine the method of transmission. And they get to determine what that original, what that reading is going to be. The original is no longer the relevant issue at that point. And that's the problem with a controlled transmission of the text over time, is the ultimate locus of authority and certainty has to be switched from the original and the manuscript tradition itself to a secondary source. So, for example, there are religious groups that will have prophets that come along at a later point in time. Let's use a really good example of this. Joseph Smith creates the inspired translation of the Bible. He's a prophet. So he takes Romans chapter 3 and the description of God as the one who justifies the ungodly, and he inserts the word does not, the God who does not justify the ungodly. Now, the reason that a Mormon should accept that reading is not because of any historical evidence, not because of any manuscript evidence, because there are no manuscripts that support it. But if you say he's a prophet, then he has a higher authority than the manuscript tradition in the first place, and that's why you accept it. And so there's a good example of an authority moving in. The farther back you push the authority, the less certainty you end up having of the resultant text, because farther back in antiquity, then any sources that could allow you to try to separate that out and determine original readings become fewer and fewer and harder to find.
Yeah, like for example, say like the earliest, I can't remember the surah at the moment. It's in the Sirah Surah regarding the Satanic verses incident. Like for example, that incident may have been the original text of the Quran, but later when Uthman got control of the text, he edited it out. Would that be such an example?
Well, if there's evidence, see, that's just it. If we don't have anything prior to Uthman, and there are some that feel that we do, there are some who believe that some of the Sa'ana palimpsests have a possibility of being pre-Uthmanic. But especially if you listen to my debate with Adnan Rashid from London.
Yeah, I watched that one.
He made it very clear, hey, he's perfectly happy having what Uthman produced. That's good enough. And, and the crowd roared. They're like, yeah, oh yeah, that's great. And didn't realize that they were saying, we're not concerned about the original. We are concerned only about the traditional that has become authoritative in our system. And as long as we can know what the traditional is, then we really don't care. Which, of course, I find to be highly inconsistent with Islamic theology. I mean, if Muhammad's the final prophet, then you need to have what Muhammad gave, not what somebody thinks he should have given 20 or 30 or 50 or 100 years later. It doesn't make much sense to me how they can think the way they do, but some of them do.
Yeah, because I remember that he was forced to concede that the Quran was not perfectly preserved, if I recall correctly.
Well, and Yusuf Ismail admitted that there were textual variants as well. I'm not sure that I think once someone is finally put in a corner and they have to admit the existence of some of the variants, the automatic thing is, yeah, but they don't really matter. But you and I both know in talking with Muslims, that's not where they start. They start with perfection of transmission, and only when faced with overwhelming evidence is there any willingness to say, well, yeah, but if there are any variants, they don't really matter much. But the problem is, with a controlled text, you don't know that. You don't, going back to 1 John 3:1, if we only had one manuscript of 1 John, then we would have no way of knowing whether that key phrase, which confirms our adoption as sons and daughters of God, was there or wasn't there. But we have many, many manuscripts. But that's only relevant in the freely transmitted text. Once you get into the controlled transmitted text, the number of manuscripts is irrelevant. It's the controlling authority that determines those things.
Yeah, because I remember in your debate with Adnan, he was forced to concede to the fact that it was not perfectly preserved and that there are variants. And basically, like you said, they demand the absolute perfectionist position, but when you press issue on, then that's where they're forced to concede because, basically I'm familiar with this because I've interacted with Muslims repeatedly on this issue. Anyway, I got to get going to work, but it was nice interacting with Dr. White, and hopefully, God willing, we'll speak again if you attend one of Jonathan's webinars again.
All right, thank you.
Sure. God bless and grace and peace in Christ our Lord.
Thank you, Stephen. Let me just pick up one or two of the questions that have been submitted, and then we'll go to some more people with hands raised. An anonymous viewer wanted to ask, was the Old Testament controlled transmission or free transmission?
The Old Testament's a completely different story, completely different history, significantly older, much longer period of writing. It just doesn't even fit into either of the categories because of its antiquity. So it's a much more complicated issue than either the Old or New Testament because of its tremendous antiquity. I think it would fall into, by necessity, because it's, when you think about it, the original documents are the covenant documents of the founding of the nation of Israel. They are covenant documents, and so I think that would definitely fall into a controlled transmission situation. But it's different, much different, because of the fact that it continues to develop generation after generation, century after century. It's not like with the Quran, you have a instant body of text of a certain length that then has to be transmitted through political means. Whereas the Tanakh, the Torah, obviously comes long before the rest, and then becomes the foundation of the exhortations of the Nevi'im and the very substance, the reflections, the Ketuvim. So it's a different category altogether because the nature of the revelation and the time period over which it is given. And I normally don't get into it, mainly because if it's tough to explain New Testament textual categories in almost any context, it's a whole lot harder to do the Old Testament, because you have to talk about the development of the Hebrew language from Paleo Hebrew into modern Hebrew. You have to talk about Ugaritic and Aramaic and the translation of the Greek Septuagint and what we see from the Dead Sea Scrolls and all the different traditions that developed into what becomes the Masoretic Hebrew text. And it's a big field, and they're not very many people have a handle on all of it. But let's be honest, it's not quite as relevant, simply because the vast majority of apologetic interaction is not based upon alleged corruption of the Old Testament text, but upon the teaching of the New Testament text. And the New Testament, the Bible of the early church was the Greek Septuagint. That's even the Bible of the early authors. And so, apologetically speaking, people who want to really be prepared should know much more about the Greek Septuagint than most people do, because that becomes the source of almost, what is it, 85% of New Testament citations are from the Greek Septuagint.
Cool. Let me bring up another person with a hand raised.
I've got my hand raised too, but it's only to keep the blood from pooling in it.
Hello.
Jerry, you're up.
Oh, super. Thanks. What'd you do to your hand?
A bee decided to attack me at about 25 miles per hour yesterday morning on a 83-mile bike ride.
Awesome. Great. Hey, questions. You mentioned the discovery of the papyri, and you seemed to indicate it was almost a line of demarcation, a change in the study of it. Is there a time when these were being discovered, and are there museums that house these?
Yeah, primarily the 1930s. That's really the heyday where basically the Brits stole all this stuff from everybody else in Egypt and dragged it back to England, and people started working through all the stuff that Imperial England had brought back from Egypt, and just started discovering extremely valuable manuscripts. I mean, P52, the one I mentioned, the little fragment that most people think is the oldest that we have right now anyways, was just in a cardboard box. And some enterprising young scholar, and you'd have to be quite a scholar to have recognized it given how small it is, was leafing through a box and looked at it, and because the vast majority of papyri manuscripts have nothing to do with the New Testament, obviously. We have all sorts of letters and things like that from that time period in history. But eventually scholars started realizing there could be some real finds in here, and that's where once the word got out that you could make some money finding stuff like this, all of a sudden people were digging through everything but the kitchen sink to find this stuff. And the antiquities dealerships and things like that, there's some interesting stories. Everybody knows all the back and forth regards to Dead Sea Scrolls. Well, there's been similar things regards to the Nag Hammadi finds and Oxyrhynchus and stuff like that. And so, it would be nice if we knew where all the manuscripts exactly came from, because it could give us a little bit more of a context and stuff. But frequently, that's just not how they show up. So basically, coming up on 100 years ago would be the time frame. We're almost to a full 100 years. And yeah, it makes a huge difference. It is a big leap forward or backwards, depending on how you're looking at it, in regards to our knowledge of the manuscripts of the New Testament.
What do you make of the stuff that Josh McDowell is doing with the masks, burial masks, and all that? Is there anything to that?
Well, yeah, that's the Green Project I was referring to earlier, and nobody knows. I mean, Craig Evans came out and gave us the most information that anyone has given us, and that's been over a year. And allegedly, it was ready to come out, and still nothing. So I have not tried to pry information out of anybody. The few people that I know that I could try to pry information out of, it would seem to me that, what's being suggested to me by this delay is that once the manuscripts truly started being vetted, issues were raised in regards to the dating and things like that, which originally was put in the 1st century, which maybe is causing people to look a little more closely at them. I don't know.
I'll see Josh the end of this month. If I remember, I'll bug him about it, see what's going on there. So basically, we have the Brits to thank for all this manuscript evidence.
Well, we have the Brits to thank for stealing them from the Egyptians, yeah, and various sundry other places where they ran things for a while. The British Empire period definitely resulted in the transferal of many treasures from other lands to London, where they're nice and concentrated, easy to get to now. we could argue about the morality of that at another point in time, I guess, but that's what happened in history.
It may have been,
you know, it is what it is.
right. Speaking as an American, though, it may have been historically fortuitous, judging by the instability of the Middle East, that there's a government stable enough to preserve it, even though rightful ownership is debated at this point. But at least we have it now to look at because of the stability of the British Empire up until this point.
Well, that's true.
Next question. Is there any definitive work that someone just learning about this that you'd say, hey, you need to read this book, and this book to kind of get you a foundation in it?
If you mean textual criticism as a whole?
Textual not criticism and the lineage of the text, the handing down of the text.
Well, you know, there are standard works in the subject of textual criticism, none of which are overly fun to read. I mean, you look at the Allens and Metzger. Unfortunately, Metzger's 4th edition was co-edited by Ehrman, so you have to keep that in mind. There are key texts like that. They're not easy to read. They weren't written to be easy to read. A lot of people have found my book on the King James only controversy much easier to read because there's sort of got a goal, and it's a little bit more understandable than others. Philip Comfort's materials, he has an entire New Testament textual commentary, Encountering the Manuscripts. Those are really helpful too. And then those will then have bibliographies that refer you to the smaller works, to the articles and things like that, which might be a little bit hard to grab a hold of. But bibliographies are always the lifeblood of doing further reading.
I would just suggest there probably would be a market for a book that is popular level, and now with the digital prints that we have of these manuscripts, where you could have pictures and give the history. Hey, this manuscript was discovered here. Here's what we know about it. Here's maybe it has the, you know, it's of Alexandrian descent, or, you know, wherever those areas. That would be.
That's true. I just don't. I have a feeling the reason that it hasn't been done yet, though someone may be working on it, I think the reason it hasn't been done yet is the control of those. The copyrights on those digital images might end up putting people in competition with one another. It would make it more difficult to handle. So I don't know what that's going to end up looking like. But yeah, that would be extremely useful.
So these manuscripts are not considered public domain?
The high quality digital images that, for example, CSNTM has taken are not considered public domain.
Okay.
Because they spent the money to create the high quality digital images, and then they host them and provide the web service, stuff like that. And so you have to agree to their terms of usage. And printing that, you know, maybe an electronic version might be different than a printed version. But, you know, a program, well, you know, BibleWorks, Accordance, a lot of them are starting to have modules that have the images as a part of it. So you can get some of the CSNTM images, just not all of them yet. And what would keep that from happening, I don't know. But I have a feeling it's all about copyright, ownership, stuff like that.
So when you really study textual criticism, how do you get access to these, you know, thousands of manuscripts?
Well, if you mean the committee that does the UBS 5 and the NA 28, you know, they're the leading scholars in the world. They're generally given access because they're standing. If a layperson wants to do primary level textual criticism, I don't know any lay people that can read Koine Greek majuscule text well enough to even start the process, to be very honest with you. Right. The vast majority of lay people are going to be reliant upon the secondary texts, upon the UBS 5 or the NA Nacial 28, and that's all available in Accordance, Logos, BibleWorks. That's all on my phone.
So when they start a new translation of a Bible, where do they start? Where does the committee start?
Well, they have to choose generally what printed text they're going to use, which for almost all translations today would be the Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia for the Old Testament and the Nestle-Aland 28th edition or the UBS 5th edition, which are word for word the same as I understand, for the new. But then the committee has the right to accept a variant and not go necessarily with what is in the text. So, for example, the ESV, I think, before the Nestle-Aland 28th came out, they had the word Jesus in Jude 5 before the switch to that being the main reading in the Nestle-Aland 28th. So, but there's normally a note provided making reference to that kind of thing. But they use the printed text as their primary, but then they're also looking at the variants and have the freedom to adopt another reading if the committee chooses to do so.
Awesome. Thanks for your time. Thanks, Jonathan.
Thank you, Kerry. Let me bring up a question from Nizam, who's a Muslim in London, who asks, do you have to believe in biblical inerrancy in order to be a Christian? And do you consider only the autographed copies to be inerrant?
In answer to the second question, the very definition of inerrancy in the Chicago Statement on inerrancy is limited to the original manuscripts and does not make a claim regarding copyists at a later point in time. So a meaningful definition of inerrancy will take into consideration the process of transmission over time by differentiating between the original manuscripts and any copyist errors that would creep into the manuscript tradition after that. So the answer to the second question is actually handled in the very definition of inerrancy in the Chicago Statement on that subject. As to the first question, I addressed a similar question that came up last week on the dividing line yesterday in regards to the Trinity. And the answer, of course, would have to be very similar to the answer that I gave on the subject of the Trinity. And that is a yes and a no. A no in the sense that we cannot add a concept to the gospel that the Bible does not add to the gospel. And so there is nowhere in Scripture that identifies the doctrine of inerrancy as being the object of saving faith. But as I have pointed out many, many times before, it seems incredibly incoherent to me that a person would say, I trust in Jesus Christ for my eternal salvation, but I think I'm smarter than he was when it comes to the reliability of the Bible. That would speak of a real confusion on that person's part, that I'll trust Jesus to save me from my sins, but I think I'm wiser than he was when it comes to his view of Scripture. Now, of course, not everybody knows what Jesus' view of Scripture was. That's the problem. When you honestly examine what Jesus said about Scripture, it is very clear that he believed it was God speaking, and you never find anywhere anything that would even begin to suggest that Jesus believed that you could correct the text of Scripture, or that there were errors in the original writings of the Bible, or anything along those lines whatsoever. And so I believe that a belief that God has spoken and that he has preserved his word is absolutely central to creating any kind of meaningful Christian theology. But it's not as a belief, something that is added to the gospel. Here's a little codicil that we've added a little bit later on. You also need to believe this as well. If someone rejects biblical inerrancy, I want to ask, well, why, and what do you put in its place? What's your foundation for believing in the sacrificial death of Jesus Christ if what you're actually saying is the authors of the Scriptures could be in error? We're speaking not God's words, but their own words. So it really comes down to how you understand inspiration, whether you really believe God has spoken or not. And at that point, if you're going to believe in the divine nature of the gospel, it's pretty hard to hold that together without believing the divine nature of the scriptures. I realize there are a number of apologists who are simply tired of debating that subject, and so they put off to the side and say, hey, just take the New Testament documents as historically reliable and then build your case from there. The problem is historically reliable natural documents are an insufficient basis for the creation of the actual Christian faith. At some point, that issue has to be addressed. At some point, you've got to leave that minimalist foundation and provide a big enough foundation for the actual truth claims of Christianity. And I have criticized the minimalist approach more than once and given my reasons. And I know that since you put a lot of my videos up, you know that I've addressed that in those contexts.
Right. Let me bring up Johnny Woodrow. Johnny.
Hi.
You're live. Go ahead.
Thanks. Actually, it's a question from Barney, my son.
Hi. So if you said there was a number of notes in the margins for on text in the New Testament, how do we know what and if there are any of those notes in our Bible text today?
Right. Well, we know that there were notes written in the margin because I could bring up Sinaiticus right now and we can look at them. We can see them written in, and pretty much every manuscript has them. The question is, if we look at them, are they in the original author's hand? And if they're in the original author's hand, are there marks or indicators that would tell us that he's saying, okay, I skipped this, then when I proofread it, I discovered I skipped it, and instead of rewriting all this stuff, I'm providing it over here in the margin? Or are there not? And the problem then becomes, well, where does something like John chapter 5, verse 4 come from? Which talks about the angel stirring the waters. And it's not in the earliest manuscripts we have of the Gospel of John. It appears later. Well, scholars look at that and they go, well, we can certainly see how someone could have written in an explanatory note, because the story is a little bit difficult to follow. Why were all these sick people laying around this pool anyways? Well, because the idea was an angel would come down and stir the waters, and the first one in would get healed. Well, that's an explanatory note. And it all of a sudden appears in later manuscripts when it's not in the earlier manuscripts. And so when you ask the question, what is more likely? That this is explanatory note that then became, the person's copying the manuscript. They can't ask the original writer, did you include this or not? So what did they do? They didn't want to lose anything, so they included. Is it more likely that that happened, or that the earlier scribes deleted this line? Why would they delete it? Why would they take it out? It's much more likely that it was a explanatory note that then became included in the text itself. And so really it's a question of asking which manuscripts do and do not contain it, how early in the transmission period are they, and can we come up with a logical explanation of where the reading came from that's more compelling than the other explanation, which would be for some reason all the earliest manuscripts deleted it, and then all of a sudden it popped back in out of nowhere. Popped back in out of nowhere explanations are generally not the best ones to go with.
And also, in a few years' time, if I was to want to go into a career of textual criticism, what would you recommend for me to do now? Or
Start saving a lot of money so you can live and eat. Because I'm gonna tell you, I don't want to discourage you, but it's not quite as lucrative as working at McDonald's. It generally might be. It's a tough area, and generally only rather weird people end up working in it that like manuscripts and staring at ancient things, and generally don't ever go outside and play ball or anything like that. So, but obviously, if that is something that you find fascinating, the most useful things that you can be learning are languages, because anybody who is engaged in textual criticism needs to have the ability to see how these texts would have appeared in other languages, to read multiple language texts. Unfortunately, textual critical writings tend to be in English, German, and French. So don't follow the standard procedure of skipping all the language classes. Know not only some other foreign languages, but your own language really well too. That's probably the best thing you can be doing at your stage in life. And then, maybe looking for a woman to marry who's independently wealthy. That would help too.
So I'm learning Latin and Greek already. I'm learning Latin and Greek already.
Very good.
So would you recommend learning French and German and Spanish as well?
Yeah, well, especially French and German if you want to be able to read the primary textual critical languages, because the vast majority of textual critical scholarship is done in English, German, and French. So yeah, those would be the. Now I'll warn you ahead of time. Well, you may be a lot smarter than I am, but my German destroyed my French. I tried to learn French, but I had already learned German in high school, and then I was taking it again in college, and for some reason it just blew French right out of my mind. It's terrible. So if you can hold the two of them together, more power to you. But it trashed me. So
Cool. Thanks.
You're welcome.
Okay.
Looks like he'd be staying at home a few more years. Bye-bye. Over to you, Jonathan.
All right, take care. Okay, let me bring up a question from our submitted questions. Vladimir Susik from Montenegro asks, he says, "It's a great honor to have you on, Dr. White. My question is, are you aware of the 24 different qur'at of the Quran that still have survived today and which indeed textually differ, like, for example, in Surah 3, verse 133, Surah 3, verse 146, and Surah 21, verse 4, etc.?
Yeah, I am. What I haven't really seen has been a whole lot of in-depth discussion of the origination, textually, critically speaking, of the different readings. As you know, there's all sorts of different theories amongst Muslims as to the origin of these variations. But I think what needs to be done is, and again, the textual data just hasn't been collated and centralized enough maybe to allow this to happen, but what would be extremely useful would be a textual critical study that would trace the manuscript that were the basis of these different printed editions of the Quran, because that would, and there's been a little bit of that in I've got the top copy back there. There are a couple of charts in the top copy that at least provide the variance between the major manuscripts, but I haven't seen anything yet. It may be out there and I just haven't seen it, but I haven't seen anything yet that connects that in a meaningful fashion to collated, accessible Arabic manuscripts of the Quran, which might allow us to sort of start on both ends and work toward the middle to creating a meaningful critical edition of the Quran and identifying manuscript families. Again, the variations cannot be possibly as wide as they are in the New Testament because the Quran is so much smaller and so much younger and was a controlled transmission. So I would think it would actually be easier to do by a long shot than it would a similar type of project for the New Testament.
Vladimir is also asking, Dr. White, since we know that the letters of Ignatius were freely transmitted, what would be your comments on 3 recensions of those letters, and would you agree that the short recensions would be the most accurate one?
Yeah, I don't think there's too much question that the shorter recension it has to be the default text of Ignatius's epistles. And that is, I raised the issue earlier, anytime we use patristic sources, there is a second layer of textual critical study that has to take place, because you not only have the transmission of the text of the early church father, but then you have the transmission of any biblical citations. And the really difficult determination, was this person quoting from a manuscript or from memory? And is it possible that in the transmission of that text, you've had the taking of that text and making it fit the current ecclesiastical text of the day of the whatever scribe that was? So there's a number of issues that come up, but especially in regards to Ignatius, yeah, the shorter version needs to be the default, but that doesn't mean that the longer version shouldn't be looked at all. It just simply means that that in light of how much expansion and anachronistic expansion exists in the longer version, that clearly that particular work has encountered, given the existence of the pseudo-Ignatian epistles, that's even more important. There has been a willingness on the people in centuries afterwards to use Ignatius's name for their own ends. And so that's something that needs to be factored in and examining it as well, definitely.
Salvador Cordova, are you with us?
Hi, can you hear me okay?
We can hear you fine.
Oh, God bless you, Dr. White. I'm an evangelical Christian, and I have a question regarding the early church fathers, particularly Irenaeus. And I heard that the Nag Hammadi manuscripts sort of confirmed a lot of what was handed down about Irenaeus, and that kind of leads to really the heart of my question is that scholars like Ehrman have said that a lot of things were added into Christian theology about like the divinity of Jesus and the Messiah. It seems to me, even outside of the New Testament, that the resurrection of Christ was pretty central to just about the practicing believers at the time. It's hard for me to imagine when that the doctrine of the resurrection was inserted. I can't reconcile it. And so things like Justin Martyr and Irenaeus seem to suggest to me that the idea of Jesus rising from the dead, it wasn't a later insertion into the New Testament.
Well, I need to point out that at least in his current position, which has changed over time, Ehrman seems to recognize the centrality and the early nature of the resurrection narratives, and doesn't, as far as I know, is not positing that is inserted after the writings of the New Testament, but his whole focus now is upon the period between the events of Jesus' life and the very first writings, which he tries to push back as far, but it's all within the first century. And so his argument now is that very few number of decades between the end of Jesus' life, which he affirms in regards to crucifixion under Pilate, by the way, and the first written Gospels, which he puts, around AD 70. So basically that 4 decades is the period of development. It's a very small period of development anymore. He's really getting pressured. Maybe at a time in the past he may have put something, past the first century or stuff like that. But as I understand now, especially listening to his dialogue with Malcolm from just a few months ago on Unbelievable, he's pretty much limited to that 40-year time space now. For all the development, all the oral tradition, everything has to come from that time period now. And the idea of inserting something into the New Testament, I don't think he believes that that's really a possibility.
Thank you. That was the bulk of my question. Thank you very much, and God bless you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Salvador. Okay, let me bring up another question from those that have been submitted.
So, by the way, Jonathan, is the Wesley Huff in the chat who's speaking next week?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Because he says I'm a starving textual critic. So I just didn't know if he was verifying the truthfulness of my statement. I'd fist bump him through chat, but my hand hurts too much to bother, so I
won't. Brian Marion from South Africa asks, who is the most important person in terms of the current Arabic Quran, Zayd, Uthman, or the 1924 Egyptian compiler? I forget his name.
Could you repeat the first part of the question?
Who is the most important person in terms of the current Arabic Quran?
Current. Well, I don't know if you can prioritize those things, because obviously Uthman was extremely important in creating the text that has been transmitted as the standardized canonical form. But the very fact that the Egyptian school system asked for a standardized Quran indicates that they were tired of encountering variants in the printed editions of the Quran as it was. It would be nice if we had some kind of meaningful information as to what sources they derived their readings from, but we don't. We just don't have that information. So I suppose, they all have an important element. I don't know how I would prioritize them, but obviously the 1924 work is extremely important, but we don't even know what sources they had, or who made the final decisions when there was a difference, and hence you can't, there's no way of controlling it. You can't. There's no way of criticizing it in a meaningful fashion. At least, compare the situation we have with the 1924 Quran and the Nessialan 28th edition. Or go back to the UBS, just the first UBS text. Because Metzger published his textual critical commentary, I'm just looking to see if I have my separate one lying around someplace. I don't think I do. Because we can go back and we can see exactly what the discussions of the editorial committee were. And the nice thing is you have the other readings at the bottom of the page. You have none of that with the 1924 Quran. There are no textual notes. There's no record of what the discussions were, sources, arguments, nothing. And so I've always found it strange that many of my Muslim friends will point to Metzger's textual commentary. Well, see, this is all man-made. Excuse me. If having an editorial committee making decisions makes it man-made, you had the exact same thing. You just don't know who did it or why they did it. Why do you think that's better than knowing who they did it, having all the information that they had, and being able to examine it for yourself? Obviously, from my perspective, it's much better to have full disclosure and all the information than just a bunch of questions, which is really what they've got.
Right. Rudy asks, and he says, I have heard Muslims say that because Muslims at the time of Uthman still had the Quran memorized, that they would have been able to spot discrepancies in the Uthmanic revision that did not comport with the original revelation. How do we answer this objection?
Well, that's a really common one. The problem is quite obviously that anyone should recognize the difference between an alleged memorization of a text and the written form of a text. I don't know if anybody else saw the little video that popped up, I think it's only yesterday, the day before yesterday, of groupthink, where the lady goes into a doctor's office, and every time a little sound goes off, everybody in the doctor's office stands up and sits down. And at first, the lady who doesn't know what's going on is just, but by the second time it goes off, she starts joining them. No one tells her why, but she starts doing it. Then they have everybody slowly leave, so she's the only one. And then another person comes in, and the beep goes off. She stands up, sits down. The guy goes, "Why are you doing that?" And she says, "Well, we're supposed to." And she teaches him to do it. So it was a fascinating illustration of how groupthink works. And quoting things in liturgy is another example of groupthink. And the problem is the hadith themselves show us that this wasn't working, because what was the very first motivation that led people to go to Abu Bakr and say, collate the Quran, but differences in recitation from people in different parts of the Islamic Empire. And so when it comes to something that's memorized, and a group of you are quoting it together, when there's a difference, the people who may be right may still give in to the people who have a stronger personality as to what the actual reading is. The reality is you need the written manuscript tradition, because the quote-unquote memorized is far more malleable and far more likely to become compromised than the written manuscript tradition is. That's the reality of the nature of things. And so it just flies in the face of al-Bukhari, who, when the memorizers of the Quran were killed at the Battle of Yamama, what was the fear that they had? That a kathir, a greater part of the Quran, would be lost if further of them died on other battlefields. And so they recognized that the number of memorizers was vitally important, and yet no one person seemingly had it all. And so it's a very common claim that is made, but it's a claim that really doesn't make much sense and doesn't really answer to the strict demands of history.
Gordon Revolta from Scotland, you're back. Go ahead.
Oh, hello. Slightly off topic because it's the Old Testament, a verse that gets bandied about quite a bit, I suppose, in this type of discussion would be Jeremiah 8:8. And I suppose the question is to both of you as to a good explanation or a good response to someone who would raise Jeremiah 8:8 and the false handling of the law by the scribes.
Yeah, there's I think, if I recall correctly, I'd have to look, but I think I actually recorded a video on that years ago on my YouTube channel. There's over 500 recordings on that channel, so I could be misremembering it, but I'm pretty certain that I did. If I didn't then, I did it on Dividing Line 1 to 2, and we don't have an exhaustive biblical index of Dividing Line either after all these years for some odd reason. But anyway, I know that Sam Shamoon has written an extensive paper on this. I remember seeing it, so it's got to be out there someplace, on Answering Islam on the subject of Jeremiah 8:8. But when you read all of Jeremiah, especially chapter 8, it's painfully clear that what's being discussed here is not an alteration of the razm, the consonantal text, the actual words of the prophecies. but because the word of God remains firm and knowable, and he holds the scribes accountable to it. Instead, I think you've probably got the same thing here that lies behind Surah 279 as well, and that is the perverted interpretations that are provided, not the actual changing of the text itself. I notice it says in verse 9, they've rejected the word of Yahweh. Well, how was that word brought to them? It wasn't that they had perverted it or changed it. They have rejected it. And that's really the issue that's going on in Jeremiah 8. And there's just so many times in Jeremiah where the people of Israel are held accountable to the content of the revelation they've already received, that obviously it's not, well, it's gone, it's been changed or something like that. And instead, the scribes, the priests, these corrupt religious leaders are condemned for their hiding of the word of God, or their perversion of the word of God, or their ignoring the word of God, but not for their destruction of the word of God, because that wouldn't be possible to do. And you couldn't hold them accountable for something that actually hadn't been revealed in the first place. So again, I bet you if you do a search on answering Islam, you'll pull that one up I was referring to.
There's also a similar verse. There's also a similar verse, Gordon, in the Qur'an that you might be familiar with. It's in Surah 15, 90 through 93, where it says, like as we sent down on the dividers those who made the Qur'an into shreds, so by our Lord we would most certainly question them all as to what they did. So one could perhaps argue that similar, if you're going to be consistent.
Was that 1993, did you say?
That was Surah 15, verses 90 through 93.
All righty. Cool. Yeah, my other question that I've asked in the online thingamadoo was to do with, it's maybe slightly off topic again, but yeah, obviously there are no textual variants with John 1:1, as I know, but the Jehovah's Witness.
Did you say John 1:1?
Right. Yeah, I don't think that there are any major variants. I don't know, but the Jehovah's Witness, their modern translation of the Greek seems to be quite. So a modern, normal Christian translation, as far I've got the links in the question itself, but it's only the verb to be, which seems to have changed, all this time in modern Greek, and so the verse is very similar in a modern Greek translation to the Koine Greek translation, but the Jehovah's Witness Greek version of their NWT is a bit, it seems really mangled compared to the Koine Greek, and it just seems. Oh, you guys are frozen.
Okay, well, two things.
Yeah.
There are some that point to a Syriac rendering of John 1:1 in support of the rendering "a God." There's been a fairly for some reason Siri, when I said this rendering of John 1:1 support the rendering of "a God," Siri's response was, "It's all a mystery to me." I didn't know that the iPhone was concerned about New Testament textual criticism. Well, I guess it is. Anyway, one of Dan Wallace's doctoral students has written a fairly lengthy article in response to that. I think it's available online. I know I've read it somewhere. But just so you are aware that that is sort of a online, the Uber Arians are using that one these days. There really aren't any major textual variants in the Greek manuscript tradition at all. This is totally a translational issue, and it is all about how you render a pre-verbal anarthrous predicate nominative. And the inconsistency of the New World Translation is patently clear. The vast majority of places where they have an anarthrous use of theos is not translated as a god. If they were to argue that every anarthrous theos should be translated a god, verse 6, I believe, would be there is a man sent from a god, because it's anarthrous there. Most Jehovah's Witnesses really don't have a clue what they're talking about on this. But online, you will encounter some who, will read more scholarly material and can try to present at least something that sounds a little more meaningful as to a defense of a God. But the reality is that if there was an article before theos in NRK ein ha logos kai logos ein proston theon kai ha theos ein ha logos, that would actually teach modalism, because that would make the verb equative. So all of God was all of the Word was all of God, they're exchangeable. Well, that's not the point of John 1:1. The first two clauses have differentiated between the Logos and Theos. So Dan Wallace's discussion of this, I think, is accurate and is the best, that what is being described here is the nature of the Logos. The Logos is as to his nature deity. And that fits the usage much more. But again, if you put that article in there, it would actually be teaching something that the witnesses don't believe, and that Christians don't believe either. So the lack of the article is just simply the indication of the predicate nominative, and placing it before the verb makes it descriptive of the nature of the Logos rather than an identifying term.
I think, are you sure it's the Syriac version and not the Coptic Sahidic?
I think it's, Coptic is right, yeah.
There's the article, there's a good one by equip.org or something like that. Similarly, Peter Williams of Tyndale House, he's a Coptic scholar, and he has some good ones on that. And am I right in saying that it's an example of Caldwell's rule? And yeah.
Well, Caldwell's rule wouldn't have anything to do with the Coptic.
Not the Coptic, no, but I mean in the Greek.
Right.
Is that right? Caldwell's rule?
Well, yes and no. There's some question about application and the discussion of Caldwell at that point. I prefer a little more simplified understanding that Dan Wallace has presented, but it's relevant in regards to the positioning of the predicate noun. But there are some reasons to question the full application of Caldwell's rule there. We can't get into right now.
The way that I've typically tried to address the John 1 argument in debate, being not a Greek expert, is to look at the context, look at verse 14, which says that we've all beheld his glory, which is a direct allusion to Isaiah 40, because it then goes on to introduce John the Baptist, who says, "This is he of whom I said he who comes after me ranks before me because he was before me." And then John the Baptist alludes to Isaiah 40, saying, "I'm the voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way for Yahweh, and make his path straight," as the prophet Isaiah said. And so the context seems to quite clearly demand that it's talking about Christ being Yahweh.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Well, gentlemen, we've been going 2.5 hours. How long do you go?
Are you ready to wrap up?
I think it probably need to take another Benadryl, before my hand explodes.
Okay. Sure. So do you want to wrap up now, or do you want to go for 5 more minutes, or what do you want to do?
Let's go ahead and wrap up. I think it's a good breaking point.
Okay. Well, thanks, Dr. White, for joining us. It's been a real pleasure, and we've all learned a lot from your knowledge and experience.
Well, I'm looking forward to maybe someone can send me the link to next week, because I'd like to hear what the starving textual critic has to say about Bart Ehrman, because that's something I've done a little work on myself. So. Yeah,
it will be the same URL as this week, but I'll send you a reminder if you like.
Okay, I appreciate it.
All right.
All right, thank you. God bless everybody.
Thank you, Dr.
Bye-bye, all.
See you, Doc.
We'll see you.